Hey there, folks. Sitting here on my step, smoking my Sea Smokes pipe, enjoying it quite a bit. Smoking some of that San Sepulcro, enjoying that as well. Put out a video a couple of days ago. The title of it was Knowledge. And I got some great responses to that. And I appreciate all of that. I replied in brief to a couple of them. I felt trying to go back and forth in the comments might have been tedious. Some of the comments were like, 6 or 8 inches long as you scroll up and down through there. And there's nothing wrong with that. I appreciated them. But several different points were brought up. Some in agreement, some not necessarily. I wanted to thank everybody that commented on that. If you haven't seen that video, and you got a few minutes, maybe go back and check it out and see what you think about it. And then read through the comments. But I wanted to address some of those comments. And when you guys posted these comments, I read them, acknowledged them, thought about them a little bit, and then I kind of moved on. I haven't been dwelling on them or particularly trying to come up with a perfect response or anything like that. I'm just going to wing my way through these comments because I think there's some really good stuff in here. First of all, Charlie, and these are in the order that the comments came in, and you can go back and read them. I'm not going to read everything that was written. Charlie says, I think if you could unwind all the twists, turns, and contortions your mind takes on this one, it would rival a mental version of an Australian Aboriginal society walkabout. Yeah, welcome to my world, Charlie. Sometimes I get all these thoughts are like, ropes in my head, and instead of untangling them and trying to do so, I end up pulling the ends tighter. But and then Charlie went on to say he agrees with some of the things I said and appreciates the questions that were posed and that kind of stuff. Kirk Maxon talked about some of his history and where he saw poor management. I talked about the Peter Principle in that video, and he talks about what he saw in some of those institutions that he was involved with. Appreciate that, Kurt. Mark at TPI, his initial comment was, you're being too polite, or you're being polite, Chad. Truth is, as the definition states, and this is so commonplace now, it's almost like humans will stupid themselves away before they even know why they've become extinct. I tend to agree with that. And then he goes on to say, starting with teachers, professors, willfully ignorant politicians. Ignorance is not bliss. And he says, if we can get through to them soon, we will all suffer. If we can't get through to them soon, we'll all suffer the ill effects. And I commented on that one. Perhaps politeness is what's missing in the general conversation. And he replied to that, polite without compromise is what's missing, my friend. There comes a time when blowing smoke has become redundant. And he goes on to say some nice things about appreciating the video and stuff. So I kind of have not necessarily a problem with that thought, but it brought up some interesting questions for me. So this is specifically for you, Mark. Politeness without compromise. My question is, compromise of what? If it's compromising our moral base and things like that, I tend to agree with that almost completely. I don't think we should compromise our morals in the way that we deal with people. We should use them wisely in the way that we deal with people. And I think sometimes that might look like compromise. If you're talking about compromise as far as two parties having a discussion or a debate or political factions going at each other and things like that, I think compromise is almost necessary. If two parties are not willing to have some form of compromise, they're never going to come together, and there's going to be, neither side's going to win if that's what the end goal is winning or moving forward. I think when you're having conversations and debates and things like that with people, part of the process is learning what's too important not to compromise on, and learning maybe where there's some leeway in your thinking and things like that. If you're not willing to compromise across the board, if you're that firm in whatever it is that you're arguing or believing or thinking, there's little potential for growth, I think. Compromise may lead you to become stronger in the ideas that you have. It may lead to better ideas that support ones that you already have. It may lead you to change your mind on something. And if that's done in a way that you feel is vital to move forward, I can't see that as not being a good thing. So maybe you can clarify exactly what you meant on that. But that was kind of my thought on that. Let's see. Moving on, we've got 13 Pipes. He said, and this is a common thought among some of the commenters here: unfortunately, knowledge does not guarantee understanding. And what's worse is that understanding is personal and cannot be shared, taught, or approved by anybody or anything. And he says, but perhaps that's not a bad thing at all. First part of that I agree with. Knowledge definitely does not guarantee understanding, not in any way, shape, or form. That was kind of the basic thought behind the video that I did to begin with. Understanding is personal and cannot be shared, taught, or approved. That I'm not so sure I agree with. I think if we have an understanding of something, it's kind of on us to share that, to try to help somebody or to guide someone, maybe help them to figure out what they believe about a thing. And in sharing it, that could be in the form of personal conversation, it could be in the form of debate, or it could be in the form of education. You can't teach understanding. You can't share understanding, but you can teach and share the things that will lead a person to gain an understanding of whatever the thing might be. Not in all cases, obviously, but as far as the approval of understanding, I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what you mean by that, but nonetheless, I appreciate the comment. Steve, Smoking Cardboard, he's got kind of a long comment. I'm going to scan through it. Who are we to trust in teaching us truth? What is truth? And he goes on to say, how does one learn if they never listen? That's a great point. That's kind of the point of what I was talking about, and what some of these type videos have been for me is about sharing my views and hopefully people listening to them and then forming or refining their own views. It's not about changing somebody necessarily. It's about if I can make someone think, and they come back with a comment such as this one that makes me think, then man, that's a plus plus for me. And then he says something I think is extremely important. And he says, might it be more important to know how to care for others than to know the facts? What does it look like to love each other first and foremost? He goes on to talk about personal experience about his college. And then he says, I'm less concerned on getting all things correct and more looking to find things worth value. I'm the same way. Instead of looking for happiness or success or something like that, I'm looking for meaning. And I think if more people had their goal pointed more in that direction than happiness, they would probably be more happy. But yeah, appreciate that comment. Boris the Piper says, one thing going wrong is that it's easier to think that opinion is knowledge. Absolutely. You can avoid to challenge your opinions and instead listen and only follow the media, etc., that strengthen your opinion. Getting trapped in that little bubble. Confirmation bias. Absolutely. Opinion is not knowledge, and it's not a sign of stupidity to admit that I don't know. If more people could understand that, man, what growth could that lead to? People are too steadfast and too egotistical and, yeah, to ever admit that they might be wrong or that they don't know the answer. Tony 513, who made a video about my video, a very glowing appreciation of my video and of me, and it was very humbling. He said a few times in there, man, I bet Chad's watching this going, man, shut up. You were right. I didn't respond to that video because I never could put into words what I really wanted to say, but yeah, I appreciate that. I appreciate you too, man. And his comment is another really long one. I can't read through the whole thing, or you can go read it for yourself. But he says he thinks people should never get to a point where they think they possess all the answers. And sad to say, I think we're at that point with a wide swath of humanity. Never too old to learn or too young. And then he says the day society forgets the history of humanity, that's going to be the day I believe we'll find ourselves in the deepest of holes and could possibly be the very demise of society. I'm not so sure that we're not a lot closer to that than we realize. And he goes on to say quite a bit in this comment. Sorry, I'm kind of scrolling through his thing. And he talks about generational differences, which I talked about, the boomers and the millennials and things like that. And he kind of touches on that with both sides being reluctant to embrace the other's way of thinking, possibly, or at least listen to it. And yeah, and he goes on to talk about people's blinded hearts and minds. They're going to have to be woken up. I agree with that as well. Doug, One Noggin, echoes some of what Tony said there, and he says, quote, knowing is half the battle. And I agree with that. The point I was making in that video wasn't that knowing is not good, even though the little thumbnail I had said, what good is knowing? The accumulation of knowledge does not lead to wisdom. fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. I agree. And Greg, the tunnel take, says, so the little thumbnail, I said, what good is knowing? Well, his comment was, what bad is knowing? Just had a squirrel fight. One of them fell off the roof. That's the first time I've ever seen that happen. Greg says, what bad is knowing? If I implied that in any way, I didn't mean to do that. I don't think there's anything bad about knowing necessarily. But that did lead me, the comment I made was, that's another thought I heard recently that's been bouncing around my skull. Is literacy always a good thing? It's a very interesting subject to kick about, and I might do a video about that. I heard someone pose that question without really delving into their thoughts about it, and I thought it was fascinating. But, you know, what bad is knowledge? I think that would be situational. If somebody has the knowledge of how to perpetrate evil or something like that, obviously that's a bad thing. But in general, I think the more you know, the more tools you have in your toolbox, the better off you'll be and the better society might be. It's just how we use it. Howard. Great comment. Undereducated, inexperienced, and a smart ass to boot. Yes, sir, I'm the complete package with humility out the wazoo. And he says the real question, and this gets deep right here, the real question is, how do we know what we know? Epistemologically speaking. He's getting back into the philosophers and questioning what knowledge is and our understanding of ourselves and things like that. And yeah, that's a deep one. That's not something I'm prepared to tackle right now. He says, I believe there are limits of language to convey, limits of mind to comprehend, but you're on the right track. I appreciate that, Howard. Yeah, that's a great subject to dig into if you haven't. And then NJ Piper had another long comment, one of the longer ones here. And he talks about a lot of stuff. And he says, the first thing that popped into my head was, I don't think society in aggregate is necessarily dumber or stupider than at points in the past. I just think the internet and social media makes it seem that way far too often. I agree with that for the most part. Well, I agree that I think society has advanced in its knowledge base and the amount of things that we know versus what we knew in the past. Whether that means we're smarter, I don't know. I just think it means we have more tools with which to explore what we do and don't know. Yeah, and he says one makes a really great point. Dumb people tend to be very loud, and it makes for entertaining news, and that's true. As far as generational knowledge shifting, he says, I think you're spot on. And he goes on to say his dad knows how to do things he'll never know how to do, and vice versa. He says the linchpin is individuals' attitudes about what they know or don't know, and their willingness to accept it, ask for help, and be willing to learn. That's absolute key. And he goes on to speak of some personal experience. And this is something he said that I think far too many people, and I referenced this in another comment that was made a few minutes ago, one of the most liberating feelings I've ever had is being asked a question in a meeting and saying point blank, I don't know. So, but I made sure to say I'll look into it and find out. Some people find it very difficult to admit not knowing, to the point where they will literally fabricate complex lies to maintain the illusion that they know something. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. And then he goes on to talk about debate and basically the opinion and how debates take place, positively versus negatively, and how it all goes to crap when it trends toward that negative attitude. And then he says he's kind of iffy on the erasing history thing. Am I talking about anything specific? He said, I immediately thought about the statue thing, and I don't think history resides in statues. I think it resides in what we record, document, and maintain over time. And then he talks about kind of the history of how a lot of our statues came around, which I saw a really great video on that too recently. It was really interesting. I wasn't necessarily talking about the statues. I think that's a symptom of the problem of erasing history, and we're seeing that whole concept of trying to erase or hide or change history take place in so many different areas. We're seeing it in education by them dismissing entire fields of study. There's been a movement where they're trying to get rid of the STEM fields of study: science, technology, engineering, math, for whatever nefarious reasons they attach to that, whether they think it's maybe racist or misogynistic or whatever it might be. We're seeing it in not wide scale, but we're seeing it with things like book burnings, canceling TV shows, going back and re-editing TV shows from the past to take things out, erasing things like, and you can debate the validity of this, whether it's right or wrong or how you feel about it, but like sports teams, product names, I've seen them going after the naming of plants and birds and astronomical things. This planet was named by someone who we think is racist. We should rename this planet. All kinds of things like that. All kinds of these little micro chunks that they're taking out of history. And I think eventually, if they keep going down that path, if we keep going down that path, we're going to have things named like, Planet X431, and there's going to be no humanity or art attached to some of these things. I've seen them going after the bird that was named Townsend's Warbler, because Townsend was a bad dude. And is it important to me that bird be named Townsend's Warbler? Not really, but at the same time, why is it so important that the name of a bird be changed simply because of the way some people feel about the person that is credited with having given it its name? It's just, there's a ton of those things that, taken all together, the whole cancel culture thing, all that stuff taken all together is dangerous to me. And as I said in the original video, if we, shutter history or send it to the waste bin, there's going to come a time where some things that happen in history are going to be vital for us to understand, and there's going to be little to no understanding of it, even little to no knowledge that it even happened. And you can look back through history even where things that have happened in the 20th century or the 17th century or whenever could have been avoided if people only understood the history that came before, that got them to the place they were, and what got them out of that place in previous times. And I think it's a very dangerous thing. I said to someone in a comment recently about that type of thing, about canceling someone. I think it's super important, whomever that person may be, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, they all have baggage. They all had baggage. They all did some wonderful things. And if we only focus on one or the other of those things, we're missing the complete picture. And everybody from this point back had something to contribute. It may be minuscule in some instances, it may be magnificent in some other instances, but if we start picking those things apart and taking away the bad and only leaving the good, first of all, who gets to determine what's bad and good? But more importantly, we're going to remove the things that are there and should be there that will teach us lessons. And that's kind of what I meant for that. And then he says, sorry for the long comment. Well, sorry for the long reply. But yeah, he's got a great comment. I think there was a follow-up to that. Oh yeah, he goes on to talk about college, and the focus on different college courses and different college educations and things like that. I agree with what he said there. Basically, what he said in a nutshell is we're being taught to get through whatever it is we're doing. We're not being taught to get through it with an understanding or with anything valuable that we can take from it going forward. It's just get the work done and move forward. Mr. Tolson says, I touched on about 50 solid topics that he could have spent hours discussing with me. And then he goes on to say some really nice things about me. I appreciate that, Mr. Tolson. And that's what this is. That's what this response is part of, is inviting you and anybody else that watches this, specifically the people that have commented on it so far, to spend hours discussing it. Make VRs. Comment on this. Go back and comment on that first video. Whatever you feel is appropriate. But yeah, I think keeping the conversation going can only be a good thing. KJ85 says it's scary that opinions have started being recognized as fact by some and dismissed just as quickly by others. It seems the middle ground has become very slim indeed. I agree with that, with the thought behind that. I think the middle ground is like a chasm in between whatever two parties you put on either side of it. And that chasm is extremely deep. I don't think it's that far across. And I think the conversations that we can and should be having are what's going to build that bridge across that chasm. If these people over here can't hear what they're saying because they're too far away, they're never going to understand what the other side is thinking. And they're never going to be able to address it in a logical, compassionate, understandable way. And I think it's going to take bravery, and when it comes right down to it, for somebody to actually build that bridge, to be the first person to go across, to be the first person to say, hey, I disagree with you, but we're both humans. Let's try to understand each other and work this out. And that used to be the way it was done, and that's seemingly more and more seems to be disappearing. But yeah, Parsimonious Piper's got the last comment, and his is somewhat long. The real problems of humanity can't be solved with increased knowledge, and even its proper and effective application helps us build better mousetraps, etc. These are worthwhile, but no application of knowledge can ever fill the real voids in our lives. And he talks about Blaise Pascal and gives a quote saying, talking about truth, since this infinite abyss can only be filled with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself. I agree. And then he goes on to say, point 2, we have conflated knowledge and wisdom. Why we don't see the world improving as we accumulate all this vast knowledge. He posed that as a question. Why don't we see? He's reiterating the question I said. Why don't we see the world improving as we accumulate all this vast knowledge? Because there's no correlation between knowledge and wisdom. I understand what you're saying there. I think there is a correlation, however. It doesn't hold true, across the entire spectrum. But without having a knowledge of something, not necessarily book knowledge, it may come from experience or something like that. It becomes difficult for some people to obtain that wisdom if they just keep making the same mistakes over and over, and they don't have the knowledge to say something's wrong here. For one, they're not wise to begin with for repeating the same mistakes, but maybe if they had an understanding of what leads to that failure via knowledge, it can lead to wisdom. But I do agree that knowledge and wisdom are not one and the same, and that one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. And he talks about a personal thing with his grandmother. There's no reason to expect people with great knowledge to also possess the wisdom or goodness to apply it to the common good. Yeah, I kind of agree with that. There's no reason to expect that people are going to use the tools they've been given. Here's the rub, I think. There's no way to expect them to use the tools they've been given in a way that advances relationships or advances society or whatever you want to apply that to. But I think a lot of us are asking that question with the idea that growing relationships and advancing society is the way that I think it should be done. That's a problem when people think, if you want to do a thing, do it right. Well, that sounds like it makes sense, but what's right? What I see is right, and what that other person sees as right, often are not the same. I think what somebody said in there, and I can't remember who posted it, truth is truth. That's absolutely correct. But in this postmodern society that we live in, truth has come to mean what I believe is right. That's my truth. You hear people say, speak your truth. That's opinion. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of address some of those. I didn't go into too much detail, and I somehow still made a 33-minute video out of it. If you're part of this conversation, if you're somebody that left comments, or somebody that wanted to leave comments, or liked the video and didn't leave comments, jump in. Make a VR. I'm incredibly interested specifically in some of these commenters. I'm really interested in listening to you talk about it for however long you see fit on video.